Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Roebling, and I'd like to welcome you to this, another in our series of candidate conversations prior to this year's election. Today, it's Cook County State's Attorney Kim Foxx. State's Attorney Foxx, welcome to the Union League Club and Standard Club Candidate Conversation Series.
Thank you so much for having me. It's good to be back in our new virtual world.
Well, and we certainly want you and everybody else on the program to be back inside the club as soon as it's safe and ready for everybody to do so. So this is, as I say, the third in our series of four. We've already had, we spoke with Mark Curran, who's running for the Senate, spoke with Pat O'Brien, who's running for your job. And we understand from Senator Durbin's office that he's going to be, we think he'll be joining us next week. So our fingers remain crossed. The program, as you, I think, know from your earlier visits at the Union League Club, is really a sort of a half and half situation. The first half belongs to you. We want to hear from you. We want to hear your usual campaign speech or whatever it is that you want to tailor for us. Then we'll chat a little bit. And the back half of the conversation always then ends up being laced with the questions from our attendees. And so I'm asking all of you attendees out there right now, start thinking of your questions, don't be shy. And you just send them to me through the Zoom function. And then pretty much in order, if I see a little grouping, I might put some together, but pretty much in order, we'll go through those questions with you, State's Attorney Kim Foxx. So now the floor is yours, and we're all ears because of the importance of your post, the importance of your job. Please take it away, and we look forward to hearing.
Thank you so much, Chris. And again, thank you to the club for having me back and for having Mr. O'Brien to be able to talk about the importance of this race and to get a clearer picture of what's at stake here. I will start with the obvious. The fact that we are in our homes having this is demonstrative of a year that has been unlike any other. 2020, with the COVID crisis that we are in the midst of, has found ourselves in the cross-section of many, many issues all at once. We have the global pandemic that we're contending with. We had an economic crisis, have an economic crisis that have seen so many people lose their jobs. We've seen a rise in violent crime here in the city of Chicago and Cook County, much like we've seen in places like New York, Houston, Albuquerque, Los Angeles, at rates that many places, including here, we haven't seen in quite some time. We also are in the midst of what many have called a national reckoning around race and justice that had poured out into our streets over the course of the summer. That for many was a time of rejuvenation and awakening, for others, quite frightening. And I say that in the context that 2020, in all of its complexities and the difficulties and the challenges that we face, for me, feels eerily familiar. Feels eerily familiar to when I came into office back in 2016. For those of you who may not remember, in 2016, we had the highest level of violence in the city of Chicago since we'd seen since 1999. In 2016, as a community, we were dealing with the wake of the death of Laquan McDonald and people having taken to the streets demanding criminal justice reform. In 2016, there was a general sense in our communities here in Cook County that our system was not operating in the way it was designed for fairness, justice, and equity. And when I ran at that time, I ran on a promise of looking at public safety and addressing those systemic issues that unfortunately continue to plague our systems today. I ran in 2016 saying and owning that I had inherited a criminal justice system, one in which we had been dubbed the false confession capital of the United States, one where we had all understood and had now been taught in history books the legacy of John Burge and wrongful convictions, that for many of us as taxpayers had paid at that time over $500 million in wrongful conviction suits related to police misconduct. In 2016, it was right on the cusp of us entering into a federal consent decree around policing. At the same time, Again, we had over 760 people murdered in the city of Chicago alone, over 4,000 people shot, and very little by way of how are we addressing these issues. And so again, what I'm feeling now, this eerie feeling of deja vu, reminds us of how I started my tenure and why I'm really proud of the work that I've done over the last 4 years. To be clear, these are long-standing issues, decades long, but they take a willingness to acknowledge that we had a problem, that we have a problem. The legitimacy and the credibility of our justice system continues to need to be addressed. Because in the places where we see the most instances of violent crime, it is in those neighborhoods that they have the least amount of faith in the system. In order for us to meaningfully address violent crime, we have to work on criminal justice reform and public safety at the same time. I start here because I imagine, and I don't know what the other conversations have been, is this false choice that we have presented to people that you can care about public safety or you can care about criminal justice reform. You can't do both. And I have to tell us here in Cook County, we can't afford to think that way anymore. We cannot afford to think that way anymore. I think back to another period in our history in the late 80s and the early 90s, where we had homicide rates of over 900 people murdered for year after year, where we engaged in policies related to addressing crime using rhetoric, much like I'm hearing today, tough on crime, where we saw a real assault on communities, whether it was related to the war on drugs or penalties related to low-level offenses, where we saw swaths of our communities incarcerated at rates that we, years later, began to regret. There was this belief that it was tough on crime or nothing. And so it's an interesting thing for me over the last couple of years, and quite honestly, the last couple of months, for people to use that rhetoric and challenge how I've addressed this work. Let me tell you how we've addressed crime and being smart on crime. When I first came into office that year with the horrible murder rate and the horrible shooting rate, I looked at how we were using our resources. You would think an office of our size, the second largest prosecutor's office in the country, who had a gun violence problem, unlike other major cities in our class, I say New York and LA. The number one prosecuted offense in Cook County wasn't related to guns. It wasn't related to shootings. It wasn't related to murders. The number one prosecuted offense or referred prosecution in our office in 2016 was retail theft. It was shoplifting. Let me start with, I don't condone people shoplifting at all. But when I look at how we use our limited resources and ask myself, what is unique about Chicago? What is unique about Cook County that we spend more of our resources in a year where blood is running through our streets dealing with low-level shoplifting? Well, then I looked and realized that we have one of the lowest felony thresholds where someone can be sent to prison for over a year for shoplifting than any of our neighbors. Our threshold is $300, which is a lot of money, make no mistake. But when I looked at places like Indiana, their felony threshold was $750. When I looked at Wisconsin, their threshold was $2,000. Minnesota, $1,000. Iowa, $700. In fact, we could do a map of the United States. 47 states had a higher threshold for retail theft than Cook County, than Illinois. Well, why does that matter? It matters because when I'm looking at how we're dealing with violence in our communities, and I have to justify to you, taxpayers, that we spend more going after people for shoplifting than we do than those who are shooting, and that is disproportionate to how other major cities who also have to deal with crime and violence, and not to the extent that we do, that our priorities are very different than theirs. So we raised the threshold in our office using our discretion to $1,000. What did that then mean? It meant that those folks for less than $1,000 were being tried with misdemeanor cases, still being held accountable. It also meant that we could then put our prosecutors, our felony prosecutors, more on cases where their attention needed to be, guns. In 2017, 2018, and 2019, we prosecuted more guns. Guns was the number one prosecuted offense in our office year over year over year. For the first time, in several years. And that's despite the fact that those cases were and had been coming in, they just weren't the highest priority in our office by way of volume. Second, we were then able to create the Gun Crime Strategies Unit, which was a unit that took prosecutors out of the courtroom and put them in our communities. We identified two of our hardest hit neighborhoods on the west and south sides, Inglewood and Lawndale. And we had our attorneys working with the US Attorney's Office, CPD, churches, and community members to identify who are the drivers of violence in this community. And how do we work with them, the people who I just named, to address those folks so that we can have a targeted response? What we found, and by we, the University of Chicago did a study about our Gun Crime Strategies Unit and found that violent crime in the areas where we had our prosecutors on the ground, in those police districts, dropped at a rate that was higher than anywhere else where we didn't have folks. We started in 2 districts and we expanded to 5. Former Mayor Emanuel and current Mayor Lori Lightfoot asked us if we could expand to even more districts because we've been so successful. And how do I know we've been successful? Because in 2017, 18, and 19, violent crime in Cook County went down year over year over year. Those aren't my statistics. Those are the statistics from our law enforcement partners. We were able to be successful in shifting our priority around guns and violence, working in partnership with law enforcement and community. This wasn't a sole effort by us, but it was enabled by the fact that we shifted our priorities to deal with violence. The other piece, credibility, legitimacy. As I said, the communities that need us the most trusted us the least. I remind you, as I said before, we have a federal consent decree in place related to Chicago police. And this is not an indictment of them. It is the reality that we find ourselves in. And as a result of that consent decree and the study that was done, it showed that people in those neighborhoods believed that there were issues of systemic racism within the department, in its policing practices, and in its treatment of communities of color. And that's also demonstrated by the fact that we were dubbed false confession capital of the United States, that we had more people wrongfully convicted in Cook County than we had in Los Angeles or New York or our counterparts. This was, again, as we already knew, a history and a pattern that was inherent in our justice system before, long before I got here. In fact, there was a report done in 1965 that showed the relationship between the police and communities of color were fractured. And there were histories of abuse and misuse in that relationship. So it was important to me, in order for us to have those people work with us, the people in those communities, to demonstrate that I understood that the relationship was fractured and I had a responsibility to mend it. How do you do that? You, one, go find the problems that were broken and fix them. Our office has led the country, not the state, in vacating of wrongful convictions in the last 4 years. We have vacated over 100 wrongful convictions. A lion's share of those convictions came as a result of a corrupt police officer, Sergeant Watts, who went to prison for shaking down people in the Ida B. Wells public housing project. He went to prison and served time. And yet, nothing happened to those men and women for whom he committed his crimes. No one had gone back and undone the harm. Why does it matter? In those neighborhoods where people saw police officers engage in that behavior, it wasn't just the person who went to prison who didn't trust the system, it was the people who watched that happen. And so when someone gets shot, someone gets assaulted in those neighborhoods, they don't know if they're getting a Sergeant Watts or a good police officer. So many people take to what we call street justice, say we'll figure it out ourselves because we don't trust the system to hold itself accountable. That's why it was important for me to reboot our conviction integrity unit. That's why it was important for me to actively work to right the wrongs of the past so that we could have credibility in the communities that need us most. And I'm very proud of that work. As I said, we've led the country over the last 4 years in vacating wrongful convictions. And the unfortunate and horribly sad reality is we have a lot of work to do. The other thing, and I really want to get to your questions as we relates to that, legitimacy. We knew in Illinois that there was going to be a move to expand marijuana legalization as it has been across the country. We also knew 70s, 80s, early 90s about the war on drugs, which we all can agree was a failed effort. For many of us who know people who have substance use disorders or have lived through it and seen what happens, that this is a health issue. This is not a criminal justice issue. This is about public health. And I've heard in the wake of the opioid crisis that has gripped our communities over the last 10 years, and there was even just a lawsuit settled just yesterday in the tunes of billions to a pharmaceutical company who we know was addicting people to their medications. People need help and they need treatment. So when marijuana legalization was on the table as a legislative agenda for Governor Pritzker, I wanted to be at the table. I wanted to be at the table, one, that if we were going to legalize this product, that we had to right the wrongs of the war on drugs. We had to vacate the convictions of those who had convictions for amounts where now people were going to be able to make millions. These are the same communities, again, who've been impacted by this war, whereby selling $20, $30 worth of marijuana landed them in prison and a record that inhibits their ability to get a job, housing, and education, provide for their family. Here's the thing. Violent crime is based on a set of conditions, not just people. Healthy, thriving communities have less crime. It's just a fact if we look at the communities we have now. So if people can't work, can't provide for their families, live in areas of concentrated poverty, deprived of resources, there's likely going to be more violence. And so we need to make sure that we have pathways to people to be able to work in a legitimate and legal economy, that we're able to take away, remove barriers like convictions for things that are now legal, and actively work to get those communities engaged. And so Illinois was the first, I think Vermont just did it, to put in its marijuana legalization bill a provision where people's records will automatically be able to be expunged for amounts that are now legal. This is a crime prevention effort. Those same communities that see us doing the right by remedying the harms will be more likely to work with us. So that's been the last 4 years. And it has not been without controversy, and it has not been without learning lessons along the way. But here's what I can tell you, is that we've been a model for the nation on what a prosecutor's office can look like addressing violent crime and criminal justice reform. A model I know because on the Democratic side in the presidential race, they've adopted a criminal justice platform that mirrors what we've already done here in Cook County. I also know that it worked because we saw violent crime go down for 3 years. And as painful as this year has been, we must resist the urge to believe that the state that we are in now is the state that we have been in and the one that we're destined to remain in. What we cannot do is go back to the failed efforts of the past. We've learned far too many lessons. We've been able to have the benefit of hindsight, data, and research to tell us that in times of fear, we cannot embrace criminal justice policies that make us feel good in the moment, but undermine our long-term efforts. And that's what's at stake here. I've weathered a storm of trying to be innovative and thoughtful and creative of how a prosecutor's office should be. It is not how the traditional prosecutor's office operated before. I own that. But we can't afford, not here in Cook County, not the way this prosecutor's office behaved before, to do the same things. And so that's my pitch for where I've been, where we're going, is to take the lessons that we've learned from this year around how we prioritize our resources to keep our communities safe in the wake of this pandemic, to hear the voices of those who have taken to our streets and peacefully said we must do better, and acknowledge that that work must continue. As discomforting as it might have been for many of us, if we do not tackle these issues of race and justice, we will be back here. This will become a cycle every couple of years, and we deserve, our communities deserve better than that. And lastly, addressing violent crime by properly putting cases that don't belong in our system back where they belong. and public health and mental health and community-led work so that we can go after those who keep us unsafe. So that's my commitment. That is my passion. I say this as I can't believe I've gone this far without talking about the fact I know that these efforts are critical. I talk about those communities because I come from it. I don't ever like to leave a conversation without reminding people that I come from one of the toughest public housing projects in the country, from Cabrini. And I know that if a girl from Cabrini can one day aspire to be a lawyer, and in fact, the first Black woman to run this office, that every day that we lose a young child in Roseland or Inglewood, that we are losing the potential for that young person to have the cure for COVID or cancer. And so we must double down our efforts to make sure that we are addressing violent crime and justice reform so that all of our futures, which are intertwined, can be its best. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you very much, State's Attorney Foxx. I appreciate your words, and I'm sure our attendees do as well. And I take this opportunity. We've got a couple of questions pending right now, but we'd love to get some more in. So wherever you are, don't be shy. Just
Don't
type
be shy.
away. Let's bring issues to the fore. This is your opportunity, and we appreciate the chance to speak directly with you. So with the sense that more questions are coming in momentarily, let me just start by saying that I appreciate very much your perspective on your several years in office now. It's been a full 4 years, is that right?
It has.
Okay. And you yourself mentioned some occasions for learning and some controversy along the way. Let me ask you about the Jussie Smollett thing so that we can hear your recitation on the evolution of that issue. And I guess it's still in some sense pending, I guess. But how did we get into that? And how are we going to get through that? And what might it have said about your office or about your choices?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, I have said from the very beginning that I was willing and able for people to be able to examine how we handled that case because it did create a lot of controversy. And the results of that have been, Dan Webb for a good year investigated my office, interrogated me and others, and found three things. One, there was no outside influence in that case. None, he found none. Two, he found that there was no criminal behavior. And three, that I was not involved in the resolution of that case. I was not involved in the resolution of that case. That being said, what have we learned is that we do believe in alternative prosecution. We do believe that there are offenses, as I laid out before, that absolutely need to be handled in a courtroom and others that can be dealt with in other ways. But if we aren't transparent about how we do that work, particularly in a place like Cook County, I know the history that we've addressed. It's one of the things that distinguishes me from Mr. O'Brien. I get it. I get it. So when you are not transparent about how and why you do the work that you do, there will be a default cynicism that something must be up here. But one of the things that I point out to people, the Tribune did a story a couple months ago about the number of cases that my office has dropped compared to my predecessor. And it was somewhere of the lines of 10% more, or about 5,700 more cases, largely of the same class type as the case involving Mr. Smollett. This office has had a history, and one that, again, I stand behind, of dealing with nonviolent low-level offenses differently than we would violent crime. And so the lesson that I learned is that when you have a case where people, have a vested interest in its outcome, and this case, while for us may seem run of the mill, it was involving a celebrity where people were paying attention and the allegations were explosive. We have a particular responsibility to make sure that we handle those cases with the utmost transparency. And again, I go back to, I appreciate the attention that has been given to this case. I appreciate the attention of people wanting to know how our office works. But it is also what distinguishes me from Mr. O'Brien. I've spent a lot of time talking about the Jussie Smollett case, and I recognize that is my obligation because the people demand to know. But there's also Mr. O'Brien, who wrongfully convicted 4 teenagers for a crime they didn't commit. That's a fact. And the fact is that we have been dubbed the false confession capital of the United States because of that history. and it should be examined. And much in the same way that I have to answer for Smollett, and I should, we want to also examine that as well. And the transparency that is required of a state's attorney to be able to give those answers to the public so that there are questions that could be answered. Because I do want to litigate about transparency and about the legitimacy of our work. The voter, should ask those questions. And so I don't mind answering the question at all. We've learned some tremendous lessons from the Smollett case, but I also want us to extend that as we interrogate all of those running for this office.
Terrific. Thank you. Okay, our first question, this was actually posted at 12:02 by our friend, member Corinne Morrissey, who is also a retired professor from John Marshall. What is your response to the charge that you are soft on crime?
Yeah, I mean, I go back to this is rhetoric that we've heard for the last half century, where in the sense of where people are concerned about crime and violence, and we should be, about what the appropriate response should be. I believe we have to be smart on crime. When I tell you that we spend more of our resources going after people for low-level, nonviolent offenses than we do on violent offenses, how do we justify that? The numbers of people that we arrest and prosecute and convict don't tell the stories about public safety. People still feel unsafe. What about a justice system where we have what we call a recidivism rate, the rate by which someone is released from prison and come back in later, of almost 50% in Illinois, where people who 3 years after getting out of prison go back? It's a failed model. How do we invest our time and energy and resources in crime prevention and going after those who do the most harm? That's called being smart on crime. The reality is violent crime went down for the first 3 years. The reality is we prosecuted more gun offenses than my predecessor had the 3 years prior to that. The reality is our conviction rates have gone up in those cases of violent crime. And so we have to tell the story. We have to tell the truth. Rhetoric like that is not backed by data is just that, it's rhetoric. And so I contend with it with my record. One of the things I didn't mention that I'm incredibly proud of, we were the first and only prosecutor's office to put every piece of felony case level data on an open data portal. That was important to me because people use rhetoric like, soft on crime, tough on crime. Show me the record. I don't like anecdotes. I like data. I like numbers. I like facts. And we were the first prosecutor's office to do that. So you could see every felony case that we've reviewed, that we've started, that we've prosecuted, what the sentence was, and you can compare it going back 11 years. And so I believe if you look at my record, you look at the data, that we get beyond the rhetoric, you will see that we have in fact been smart on crime.
Okay. There will be a couple more questions on that coming up, but let me get to, let's see, Patricia Egipasio, who asks, how do you, State's Attorney Kim Foxx, feel about something called JAC funding, which I don't know what that is, that Ms. Agapasio believes is being voted on this very day by the county commissioners? Do you feel that 10 or even $300,000 contracts is an effective way to allocate funding that is designed to take taxpayer money and create a safer community? Can you help us first, since we're not all up to speed? What is JAC funding?
I hope I'm right. And if she can give you a thumbs up to let me know if I'm on the right path. The Justice Advisory Council.
Oh, right.
Is that right? Is the agency
within,
in the county. And the Justice Advisory Council has, over the course of the last several years, started to make investments in grants to community-based organizations related to violence prevention. This is work that I'm intimately familiar with. As many of you may know, I served as the Chief of Staff to the County Board President, Tony Preckwinkle, who established these grants about 10 years ago. We've increased funding, and by we, the county has increased funding to the Justice Advisory grants to address violence prevention at an increased level than we did years before. And this goes back to the question I had, or what I mentioned earlier, and as we talk about smart on crime. we backload a lot of our finances on prosecution and policing, as opposed to what are the things that stop crime in the beginning. I show up, I'm a last responder. Our office is involved only after the chalk outline has been drawn and the tape has been put up and someone is in custody. That is when we become involved. Violence prevention, investing in community-based organizations that we know have known outcomes, whether that's street interrupters, whether that's mental health, trauma services, those things have a greater return on investment because they stop someone from pulling the trigger in the first place. And so I believe that we do have to, and the language around this has gotten a lot muddy, especially over the last several months around, was it defunding the police? How do you talk about this? It is really about an allocation of resources. We spend a lot of money on the back end. The Justice Advisory grants are supposed to invest in those organizations to do violence prevention on the front end and demonstrate that they've had a known impact. So I am a firm and strong believer that we need to invest far more money at the city, state, and local level on violence prevention efforts that have been known to be proven to work. And that isn't to say that you don't invest in my job and in the roles of police, but police will tell you they're asked to do a million things. They're asked to be a counselor. They're asked to be, a therapist, a mental health person, a substance. We're asking them to do a lot of work. There are people who can actually do that work. We just need to fund them so that police and prosecutors can spend our energy prosecuting violent crime.
But I understand your statement about professionals being funded. Let's just go with that for a second. Our mutual friend Tony Preckwinkle, our mutual friend Lori Lightfoot, our mutual friend JB Pritzker, all three of them are going to say the same thing to you or to me or to any taxpayer in Cook County, and that is we're running vast deficits. We don't have enough money to fund what we currently have on the books, and future funding for say sociologists and interventional clinical psychologists and the kind of sort of community-based mental health or related activities to which I think you're referring genuinely and honestly is going to remain more or less where it is. Okay. Are there less expensive ways of preventing violence?
The question I think that I would pose back is, how much do you think we're spending now? It costs us more now by not investing in that. We are spending, it's where do you want to spend the money? It is far more expensive for us when we talk about, the cost. I think about our friend Tony Preckwinkle, the cost for a gunshot victim at the county hospital where people are not, where we, the taxpayer, are paying for the care that they get there. Is ridiculously high. When people have mental health issues, when we shut down the clinics, and I understand the choices that we have to make, people didn't stop having mental health crises. They just went to one of two places, the jail or the hospital. When we don't invest in these things, and I get it, people will say, hey, we don't have the funds. When I look at 2016, in the horrible year that 2016 was, I do also have to remind everyone that was coming off of where we had a budget stalemate for almost 2 years. And a lot of the community-based organizations that we're talking about were not getting their funding. This year, 2020, when we look at this uptick and look at places like New York and LA and others who've seen it, there's a common thread here. It's not just that there's a virus, it's that people then haven't had access to those resources to help them deal with it, those social emotional things. Kids aren't in school, kids aren't in after school, they're not at libraries, they're not invested in the things that we know lessens their likelihood to engage. So we pay for it one way or the other. And I think we have to be honest about that. I think we have to honestly say, because it has become so polarizing, where we are afraid to touch the budgets all the way on the back end in law enforcement and not invest on the front end in violence prevention. And I want to believe that, just JB Pritzker gets that. I saw the mayor's address briefly yesterday, and she talked about some additional funding, I think $5 million. We need more than that. I think everyone will universally say we need to do that. I think the fear to the taxpayer, and why I think I get on the hot seat a lot, is I'm not going to lie about the impact. Prosecutors and police are not what's going to keep our communities violence free. And anybody who tells you that, whether they're running for office or not, and in fact, I haven't heard David Brown or Eddie Johnson or any prior police officer say, or police chief say, that this is an issue that's going to be solved by law enforcement.
Okay.
And yet we all have that universal agreement, but those who are in the policymaking space are afraid to say that we need to invest more outside of law enforcement than we do in community-based organizations.
Okay. State's Attorney Foxx, Brian Daly says, CWBchicago.com and secondcitycopblog.com detail what he says are hundreds of instances of convicted felons who have been arrested for possession of firearms that your office has declined to prosecute. Clean stops, clean arrests, yet your office has declined to prosecute. What is your version of that?
Yeah.
And what message might that send to other felons? And how would that make Cook County residents safer?
Well, I want to be careful how I say this. We have to make sure we trust our sources. And I know that this is an august group of folks who are members of the club and are participating. If you know anything about Second City Cop Blog, and I certainly know that you would probably read just beyond that notion, there are things in there that are incredibly disturbing. I mean, in fact, were found by those who did the investigation for the consent decree to be very problematic in terms of their language around race and communities. And particularly, I have a sensitivity to it around some of the racist rhetoric that has been thrown my way on that blog. That having been said, why I talked about the fact that every case that comes through our office is on an open data portal is so that you don't have to go to Second City Cop or CWCB. You can look at our office and see what cases are brought to us for charges and what happens with them. Someone saying that it is a clean stop on a blog is very different than the evidence that is presented to us. One of the things, when I first came in the office, there was a shift that we had. There was a fear of rejecting, what we call rejecting a case. When police say, hey, we believe we have a charge, we believe we can make it, prosecutors would just approve every case. What happened in 2017, we looked at the data, because again, data is very important. We saw that we were losing a significant number of cases that actually went to trial. Not where people pled guilty, where it went to trial. In 2017, I believe it was May 2017, of cases that went before a judge, the conviction rate was 30%. What that means is almost 70% of the people who took their gun case to trial were winning. Before a jury, it was around 44%, which meant, again, 2/3 of the people who went to trial were winning their cases. When we looked at, well, why is this happening? Because data allows you to do that. We were able to see that a number of cases were being tossed or having issues related to stops. Was a stop a clean stop, if you will? Well, we were finding out because at a motion before a judge, a lot of this information was getting thrown out. So what we did was we started taking our data to CPD, to our suburban departments, and every month, we would show the cases we won and the cases we lost. And then we would say, hey, there's a pattern here on how this car was stopped or how this search was done. And we have never, and I want to be abundantly clear, you've never seen me in the media, in this market, pointing fingers at others. I tend to look around and there's always something in my eye. We've never done that. We've said, let's show you the data and let's work together. The conviction rate in gun cases that have gone to trial have gone up every year because what we learned is we needed to do better training together. Police officers aren't lawyers. They're not prosecutors. They're not judges. And if they don't have the same knowledge and understanding on what will meet legal scrutiny, it will be the prosecutor just didn't like my case. No, we got to meet legal scrutiny. And when we did that, we did roll call trainings. We did trainings monthly. The rate went up. We even created a manual, a handbook we call our felony review handbook that we gave to CPD and our other districts to show them what we needed in order to meet legal scrutiny in our cases. and the cases conviction rate went up. And so I'll end where I started. You have unfiltered data that comes from the state's attorney's office. It's not my spin on it. We have, it's there for you to see with your own eyes, and not through those who have an agenda that may not necessarily be in the interest of the public, but for their own subgroup.
Coming off of that, I just can't. I want to be a great devotee of Ron Allen at Northwestern Law School and say, whose course, by the way, I sat next to JB in Pritzker Roebling. And I want to ask you a tale of two amendments, because you've spoken a lot about guns, and now you've spoken about, you've put together a manual for cops on the beat. And so let me ask you about the Fourth Amendment and about the Second Amendment.
Sure.
So you're a local prosecutor and you're making felony review decisions. You're delegating that to your assistant state's attorneys, but ultimately those are your responsibility. I honestly, Ms. Foxx, you've been doing this now for 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
What have you gotten to know as an individual, as an attorney, mm-hmm. about the Fourth Amendment since you began this responsibility? What have you gotten to know about the Second Amendment since you started this?
Yeah.
And you know, these are major institutions in American life, and I wonder if you might take a moment to reflect on those.
I'll start with the Fourth Amendment. I think what I've learned, and particularly as we were going into the data, there is this sense, and it's this thing that I worry about right now, where we are very concerned about violence in our communities and what we're seeing, is that we also can't forget that the Constitution is there. And I just will be blunt. I think there's sometimes this notion that the ends justify the means, that we will work it out somehow. And what I had seen, and it's important, you know, the right to like not have someone come into your dwelling, your space, your car, whatever, is enshrined in the Constitution, even in times where things are difficult. And I've seen, and history has taught us this, not just in my last 4 years, is that somehow sometimes gets suspended in the need of, we've got to do something here. And I think my biggest knocks have actually been, we haven't talked about bail reform. I imagine there might be a question on that as well, which is enshrined in the Eighth Amendment. We've oftentimes in this system have relegated concerning ourselves with the constitutional amendments afforded to us to defense counsel. Let the defendant worry about it. I think a lot of people forget that as the prosecutor, I represent the people. And it means that I can't, no matter the circumstance, disregard the constitutional protections that are afforded to defendants. And that's a knock that I get often. She cares more about defendants. And I've heard my opponents say that, which again is really alarming to me, especially with a history of wrongful convictions, many of which were gotten with a disregard to the constitutional protections that were afforded to the men and women who were wrongfully convicted. And so what I've learned about the Fourth Amendment is, you know, I believe, in as much as I don't engage in criminal behavior, and you don't, Chris, that I don't want people being able to come into my home without authority to do so. I believe in that protection. As it relates to the Second Amendment, you know, I have strong feelings about guns. And there's this notion of, you know, we've got the strongest gun laws on the books, and yet we have all these issues. And we have a horrible gun problem in Cook County. We have a horrible gun problem. Again, 2020, we've seen legal gun owners start buying guns at rates that we haven't seen in decades. And people have a right to own a gun because it's enshrined in the Constitution. I think we need to be able to have restrictions to make sure that people who are a danger to our communities shouldn't have that accessibility. I don't think it is without constraint. So, I mean, I hope that answers your question. I mean, the Constitution is the Constitution. I have seen it be disregarded in times of stress and trouble to justify our way out of it. And that is a pattern that we had become so accustomed to in Cook County. I tell people this all the time, particularly when we talk about bail. We've become so accustomed to the dysfunction of working beyond what we were supposed to do that trying to do it right feels painful.
Mhm. We're going to get back to you mentioned the bond issue, and we are going to get that. We've got a couple of questions pending. Folks, it's quarter to the hour, so if you want to get a question, do so now. I'm going to now pose to you a question I asked Judge O'Brien yesterday. Okay, so I established the predicate for this question by referring to his background in the state's attorney's office and the fact that he had ultimately become a member of the judiciary at the Circuit Court of Cook County, and he was a full circuit judge. And I asked him, and I said, this very day or last week, Tony was speaking, and she was outlining the $700 million, concerns, financial concerns. I said, you've spent a life in this system one way or another, okay? And I asked him about reform, and I asked him about what to do with these institutions. In your case, I want to cite that 5 years ago, Tom Dart and Tim Evans and Tony Preckwinkle and our state's attorney, I mean, it might well be said that they were not speaking with each other. Friends of them all, and they're all friends with each other, but in their official capacity, they weren't working together, okay? At the time, you happened to be the chief of staff to the president of the Cook County Board, so you recall this history, you know it, you lived it, you were there for some of it, I'm sure. Making or receiving, secret messages and things like whatever. So now my question is, you've spent 4 years in office in your own right. Mm-hmm. Please tell us what needs to be done. Please tell us, if somebody came and said, okay, well, here's $100 million. Is the next $100 million going to Tom for the jail? Is it going to Tim for the courts? Is it going to you for the ASAs? Is it going to the public defenders? What I'm asking you as a almost lifelong resident of Cook County, what secret message needs to be heard now to, quote, straighten things out and get the cops in the city of Chicago and the suburban municipal jurisdictions working better with your office? What's the next 100 million? Where do you put it if you had the ability?
That's a lot of money. And I will go back to, yes, I was there when people weren't talking. And I am really proud of the fact that even before I came into office, there was a recognition that we weren't going to solve this if people weren't talking. And so the last 4 years have been all of those people that you named sitting at the table. What we do need to have is a bigger table that does include not just the chief of police for the city of Chicago, but our suburban municipalities. We don't talk nearly enough. I live in the South suburbs about the violence that we're seeing in the South suburbs. It is exceeding what we're seeing in Chicago per capita. We need the mayors there because they have a significant level of investment and expertise related to where, public health, mental health, and the like. In addition to police chiefs, we also need community members at the table because I do have, I've lived here most of my life. As I said, I've been very fortunate to live in some of our toughest of neighborhoods to a neighborhood of comfort. And so I have a vantage point. I mean, it's not new to me. I also have a brother that lives in Inglewood, where someone shot up the house across the street from him 2 weeks ago. I'm not foreign to this. I'm very proximate to this. And what I can tell you is that what people say they need is very different than what we deliver. So it's not even just my answer. I will hear from a lot of folks, and I use this example a lot. We had a 9-year-old Tyshawn Lee murdered for the sins of his father. But here's the thing. My kid who didn't go to Tyshawn's school, who was the same age, was traumatized when she saw it on the news. We have swaths of our community who are living with trauma every day, and we're doing nothing about it. But we do have guns. And there's a 13-year-old, a 12-year-old, and I'm sure you've heard Arnie Duncan talk about this because it's real, who someone will say, you need to carry a gun. And my kids, that might be foreign to them. They would be frightful. But if I went to school with Tyshawn and he was murdered, and I don't have anything else, that is a legitimate decision for me to make. And so all of these conversations about where does the money go, and it all feels so intractable and we can't fix these things, if we don't go into the neighborhoods that have the serious needs and say to them, what do you need? Because it's not just me, but we all need to be together and in concert with how we allocate that. And so for me, it isn't Tom, right? We've shrunk the jail population. It's not investing more in the jail. The jail population has shrunk. And I'm not saying take money away from him. We have prosecuted less cases. So I don't know that I need 1,000 more attorneys. I really want to stop having bodies dropping. I really want to stop people from being afraid to walk down Michigan Avenue. And so the question is, what stops that person from engaging in that behavior? But I think our table is actually too small. And that if you were just asking those 5 people what to do with extra money, yes, I could always hire more lawyers. But are you going to get a good return on that investment? Bigger table with policymakers and community, and focused and targeted attention to what those specific communities need.
Terrific, thank you. Okay, Brian Daly does take up the bond question. Your office dropped charges against those arrested for looting during the riots that followed the George Floyd protests. In August, Chicago endured another nationally embarrassing explosion of looting along North Michigan Avenue. If that which is tolerated is repeated, why should looters stop if they need not fear prosecution?
So, Mr. Daly, I'm sensing a pattern here, and I want to be clear. Our office, and I started this earlier, the way we get cases, police make arrests and they present them to us for felony charges for us to review them. Our office had a policy that we were not going to prosecute people who were peacefully assembling in the protest, exercising their First Amendment right, if we're going to hit all the amendments today. We never had a policy about looting, if you will. We always were going to prosecute those cases in which we had enough evidence to prosecute those cases. I think what happened was the media conflated the peaceful protesters from those who were engaged in looting. You and I both know those are 2 separate groups. So the police referred to us, I want to say 250 cases. We approved, for looting, I should say. We approved 90% of those cases, approved for felony charges 90%. So when people say that we weren't prosecuting them, we absolutely prosecuted the cases that were brought to us. What was confusing to a lot of people was, well, I saw, 4,000 people were arrested. Why were only 250 charged? You must have let the rest of those go. No, all 4,000 of those people weren't charged with what we would consider looting. Of those that were brought to us for those charges, 90% of them were. And then in August, when we saw the second round, there was this misperception. And I was grateful to be able to go out with David Brown and Lori Lightfoot, because there was this notion of, oh, these are the same people. But I believe the number is 60% of the people who were arrested in August had not been arrested before, not just in the previous looting, but ever. Secondarily, we, again, worked with all the cases that were brought to us for review for charges and reviewed them. And it was over, I think it was 92% of those cases were charged. So it is actually misinformation to say that our office was not charging people with looting, and further misinformation to suggest that it was because of our policy related to peaceful protests. We're talking about people who were charged with curfew, people who were charged with failure to disperse. We also put it on our website. I want to put a plug out for our website because I do believe in transparency, what the offenses were that we were not going to pursue. They were listed. And on that, it also says that if it involved a crime related to property damage or harm to another person, we were pursuing charges in those cases.
We've got a final question, and then I want to ask you about wrapping up. And in addition to your website for the official office, I want to ask you about your campaign website. But let me get to this. It's from our friend Patricia, and I really wish I was doing better with this name.
I know who she is. You don't have to repeat it again.
Okay, Edupacio. She suggests that funding for these community-based, organizations shouldn't go to brick and mortar. Web-based services are more cost-effective, data-informed, and community organizations don't use enough technology. Smarter spending would be good. I just want to be sure that she knows we got that point across. Any comment on moving from brick and mortar and cyber and
Yeah.
maybe that
Look, we're all learning. I am in my home office now because we are a brick and mortar paper organization that has learned how to zoom into the 21st century very quickly over the course of the last several months. And so I think this is a time for innovation, not just in government and nonprofit, but as a whole. And so your point is well taken. And I think a lot of entities are going to be moving more technologically forward.
terrific. We've only less than 5 minutes to go. State's Attorney Kim Foxx, thank you for joining us today. Let me ask you to sort of sum up. I think that it's fair to say that your opponent, Judge O'Brien, yesterday was talking about a return to traditional prosecutorial methodology and his belief, as one who had participated both in the local level at the state's attorney and then through Illinois Attorney General and onto the bench, that's necessary. That's sort of the vision that he laid out. Could you give us just a couple of minutes of what people are going to get out of the state's attorney's office if you're reelected for 4 more years? And then tell us your campaign office so people can, kind of go in and read your position papers or contribute or get involved, whatever it is that they want to do. It's up to them.
Thank you. Listen, I think we have the benefit of history on our side. We have the benefit of history of looking at what traditional prosecution has gotten us in terms of community and public safety. I don't mention Mr. O'Brien or Judge O'Brien's past in the office to just knock, time. He was in the office and chief deputy of the office at a time of great violence in our communities. That happened. And the response, I apologize, someone keeps ringing my bell. The response to that was these policies that he's talking about today, talking about now, which is increased prosecution, increased policing in the very communities that, again, for decades have still dealt with violence and have very little trust. I go back to the people who need the system to work for them the most trust it the least. When we went roughshod and arrested everybody in those neighborhoods, didn't make them safer. They don't trust us. That's not my assessment. Look at the consent decree. Look at the amount of money that we spent on wrongful convictions. This happened. And Judge O'Brien was a part of that history. We are in Cook County and the country, whether it's Donald Trump, who I fundamentally disagree on many issues, he has found it relevant to talk about his approach on criminal justice reform. Donald Trump, across the board, bipartisan support that we need reform. I believe that we have been on the cutting edge of that. It's been discomforting, again, particularly in a county where we for so long had been entrenched in the ideology of lock them up, that gets us what we need, to now be at a point where we're saying, listen, we want to prioritize violent crime. A lot of this stuff we don't need to do. For folks, it feels discomforting. And that's what my next 4 years are going to be, making sure we're protecting people's constitutional rights, making sure that we are using our resources effectively and smartly and going after those who cause harm to our community, and actively working with community groups and other agencies and resources to deal with those underlying issues that are not criminal in nature, but we've become the default for. And it is vastly different than what Judge O'Brien is proposing. It is vastly different because this is where criminal justice for the future is headed and not wedded to what we've done in the past.
And your website is?
KimFoxx.com, 2 X's in Fox.
KimFoxx.com. State's Attorney, great to have you on. Thank you for joining us today. Hope to see you back, as you said at the beginning, in a real meeting and not just a Zoom, but we have zoomed into the 21st century. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
And I want to thank the Standard Club. It's been a privilege to work with them. We hope, our fingers are very crossed. State's Attorney Foxx, if you are campaigning with Dick Durbin over the weekend, tell him you've got to do the Union League thing.
I'm going to send him a text actually and tell him I did it and it was painless.
Yeah. I mean, what's going on here? Okay. I mean, okay. So that's great. Thank you for coming, and we'll chat later. Okay. Thank
you.
you all. We are adjourned. Okay.